Hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Today we're going to do some more studies. Studies? You never heard that word before from my mouth, have you? Today we're going to be studying the ground.
I feel the earth move under my feet.
Yeah, that's a famous song. Carole King, that thing you walk on, something that appears in just about every landscape. The earth, the grass, paths, little rocks, that kind of thing. It's not a throwaway subject, and a lot of times it can make or break a painting. It may not be the prime subject focus in your painting, but it's worth knowing and practicing how you handle it. So don't treat the ground as just an afterthought and something you throw in at the last and hope that it works out. Practice it, study it. No, I'm not making fun of the fact that you have no feet. Let's pound some ground with a paintbrush and some paint. All right, well, as I begin pre-wetting this first square here, and I'm going to do two of these, and I will also be doing two for patrons. I want to get this nice and thoroughly soaked. What I want to do is just kind of talk through a few tips maybe, but also some principles. First and foremost, kind of tell yourself, what's the purpose of the ground? Is it just, I just don't want it to interfere with the main subject? I want it to be a main focus. Is it going to be primary in my painting? Is it going to take up most of the painting? Or is it just going to frame a subject or kind of act as a pedestal, you might say? What's your purpose in having ground? Purpose other than it logically needs to be there, obviously. Obviously, in realistic terms, if you're painting representationally, it's got to be there for the trees and the grasses and the whatnot. But beyond that, what purpose is it serving? Is it leading up to your subject? I think these things are helpful just to talk yourself through. And you don't have to be definitive in the beginning. You can kind of wait and see how it evolves and decide as you go, how much of a role, how that ground or how the area where everything sits, area in front or the area in back, whatever your ground is, it's not a minor thing. It's a key role. It has a key role. So I'm just establishing a bit of a distant tree line. In this one, I am kind of intending the ground to go from that distant tree line all the way to foreground. So it has a fairly major role in this little study. And I did that on purpose because I want to study the elements and the details that are going to go in it. I think next you just need to also think compositionally. And these are not in a particular order. They're things that you need to think about throughout as you paint. But compositionally, the ground is going to play some important parts aside from the role of your subject. It's going to perhaps lead your eye through the piece. In fact, it often does. That's a major role that the ground plane usually fills. And we are talking about a plane, so that's important. And usually in landscape, you have the upstanding elements that go more vertical, and you have the plane, which is usually the ground. There can be things on the ground, but you get my point. For instance, in this piece, it's going to take you from foreground all the way to background. So it needs some interest. And that's another thing you can talk about to yourself. What kind of interest? More on that later, though. Compositionally, light, contrast, a number of things are going to play into it. Are there paths? Are there elements that point to other elements? All of this is fair game to think about. I don't have formulaic answers, but they're worthwhile and they're valid things to consider. Another thing would be integration. Now, you're seeing me do a lot of that in this one. Integration is just how well do these details and does the ground integrate with the more upstanding elements like trees and bushes and rocks. Integration is something that takes practice. Otherwise you'll have things that look kind of jigsaw puzzle-y, something fits here and it's kind of cut out and then another piece kind of butts up to it. You want everything to kind of weave and dovetail. So integration is important. Think about how you're going to do that. Detail, in the beginning you saw me doing the wet and wet washes. It's a great way to kind of get the foreground, middle ground, and background to all kind of integrate. Integration also involves edges, transitions. You know, wherever you have edges, how do they transition? Do they look natural? Do they look real? Another thing to consider is form and flow. These land forms, it's kind of like water, although stationary, of course. They have a flow to them. They have a rhythm. They have form. Light hits them and they sometimes roll. They're not always just flat like water or like, you know, the salt flats in a desert. There's form to them. So you've got to kind of think through that. How do you want to model those forms in light and shadow? Now you can see in this piece, a path is sort of emerging. I hadn't totally planned that. I kind of hoped something like that might appear. But I like how it's looking, so I'm kind of framing that. And that's a function of form, light, shadow, detail. It's, everything plays into that. Integration. That path kind of curls my eye around and through to that back tree line. I'm spending a lot of time here thinking about details and placing them a little more precisely, not for the sake of detail, but for the sake of what my eye needs to see at any particular place. I often look at paintings, all paintings this way, you know. This is sort of an artistic thing. As it develops and evolves, you say, what does my eye want to see here? What's going to balance this? So that plays into what I've already talked about, composition, but also the more abstract artistic principles. Those are all valid ways to think about ground detail. Detail is also important in the sense of it establishes scale or helps you think about scale. So from the background all the way to the foreground, you got to keep in mind the things need to look like they're scaling properly. Like the ground absolutely does travel from foreground to background. Elements like this spatter, which can add extra texture and the appearance of extra detail, should be reserved, I think, for the foreground. I could also paint in some stones or some more distinct grasses. Here, you're seeing me adjust. I'm adjusting with some washes to model the forms of those land rolls, I guess you might say, as they roll and go backwards, just to give it a little more dimension. So again, that plays back into form. I got a little bit aggressive there with that first one, and some of the paint kind of slopped over into this next one, but let's just do another one. Talk about some of those same elements. You can decide things like simplicity. Say, I want to surround my main subject or my area of interest with a very simple background. That's a valid way to think. But if you do that, you want to make sure that your eye gets led to where you want it to go. By the way, this is sort of a side note. I've been using some of these Schmincke super granulating colors. Look at that separation. I was so excited about that. That sort of orangish color gave everything a glow, like a soft late afternoon or early morning glow. I was just really, really tickled with that. That was not planned, but it's just interesting how the water carried those sort of orangish colors a little further than the violet. I believe that was Tundra violet. Loved it, loved it, loved it. So what I'm establishing here is a fairly simple ground plane. And here we're getting back into the integration that I talked about. I want a line of trees that naturally sort of gives way to a flat area. So I'm paying a lot of attention to that edge and how the trees weave into a flatter surface. This little area to the right here is for balance. And this gets into the thing I talked about already, the artistic and the abstract. Sometimes you put something in because your eye needs it. The composition needs it to balance out what you're doing. And if I just had a big negative area over to the right and in that ground plane, I think it's a little overly lopsided. So I thought a nice little patch of something, underbrush, will help balance out that composition. Now, as I start to add my details, we get into just another consideration, elements. What's going to be in your painting? I know that's kind of obvious, or maybe it's obvious. What kind of trees? What kind of underbrush? Are you going to have a lot of rocks? Are you going to have a lot of grass? Going to have any little stands of water? What about shadows? Now, neither of these, I don't have any strong cast shadows. Light and shadow can serve both as a realistic device to help interpret the scene, but it can also be a very strong contrast and eye-leading element. One of those artistic, abstract forms I was talking about. It can also be consideration with form and flow. Again, in this piece, I'm wanting to show a little bit of undulation, not as strong of a role in the landforms as the other one, but I do want some indication that there are ridges and little furrows, just to kind of pull your eye into that lighter, brighter, negative area. Balance. Another thing to think about, the lay of the land. You want all your detail to express how that land moves. That gets back into the form and flow, but in the sense that you're telling the viewer what the land is doing. You're coming from a forested area here out into a flat area, and you're seeing ripples in the ground. That can be used both artistically, abstractly. and as an element to define your scene. And again, finishing off these pieces with details are great for the sake of adding realistic detail, but always try to have another purpose for them in mind. Establishing the scale, defining what the viewer sees, and how the scene recedes off into the distance. I was asked the other day, how do you keep your trees and your tree line from looking cartoony? Most often or not, it has to do with scale, an improper scale. Okay, thanks for coming along, everyone. I hope these clues and ideas, concepts, gave you something to think about. Here's the final pieces, and I'm pretty happy with that. Thanks for tuning in, patrons. Look for 2 more in the near future. And I thank you, patrons, so much for supporting this channel. We'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.